Well, today I'm joined by Salvatore Babones, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. Salvatore is a sociologist with expertise on globalisation, which is a hot topic today, and particularly China and the US. Pretty hot topics too, especially in terms of their relationships. His book, The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism and the Tyranny of Experts, was judged by no less than the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books on politics of 2018. And yet here in Australia, it's had lamentably low recognition, and you've had lamentably low recognition for writing it. But this, of course, was after Donald Trump's coming to power and after the historic Brexit vote. The book makes sense of those great events in many ways. Perhaps surprisingly, though, a key idea of your book has become more relevant and powerful than ever in the context of COVID-19. So thank you for being with us. Can I kick off by quoting from The New Authoritarianism? You say this: "The new authoritarianism of the 21st century is, paradoxically, a liberal authoritarianism. It is a tyranny of experts." In basic terms, can you define and describe what you mean by this tyranny of experts? And then perhaps also the other term you use, technocrat.
All right. Well, authoritarianism isn't all young men in matching uniforms goose-stepping and Heil Hitlering. Authoritarianism is any form of government where we're asked or told that we have to take the decisions of other people based on their authority, their positions of authority, and not on our own cognizance, our own judgment. So while there have been lots of fascist authoritarianisms and communist authoritarianisms, we also have an authoritarianism of the expert class. We have it right now, of course, with the coronavirus, where we're receiving essentially orders from the public health establishment telling us how we need to live our lives, regardless of the damage that might cause. We're not having true democratic debates on things like open borders or lockdowns or wearing of masks. But we've seen that even before the current crisis. I mean, if you look at areas of policy that affect virtually everyone, like central banking. Well, it's now become taken for granted that an independent central bank run by experts without interference from politics is the best way to run an economy. Well, that takes the entire economy out of the realm of democracy. Similarly with education, how many Australians actually support the Australian curriculum? I suspect if you put it to a vote, very few. But the goal is not to put it to a vote. The goal of at least the people who promote it, is to take education out of the realm of politics and put it in the hands of teachers and education professors instead of in the hands of parents and voters. So in area after area of public life, we've seen decision-making being taken out of the realm of democratic politics and put into the realm of expert administration. Now, you might get better policies that way, I can't tell you, but you certainly will get much less democratic policies that way and much less voter say over the things that affect their lives.
The American founding fathers, I think, foresaw the real dangers of what might be called authoritarian rule by people who were not elected, and wanted a system that was, on the one hand, fully cognizant of our capacity to be unwise as a mob, but on the other hand, maximised our personal freedom. Andrew Jackson was an early president, I think, who saw the dangers of that and tried to return power to the people. But perhaps ever since then, the 1820s, 1830s, there's been this drift towards technocrats running the show?
I'm a big fan of Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson was the Donald Trump of his day.
Yeah.
I remember
I thought you might say that.
His opponent was John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams is not well remembered, but he was the son of a president. He was a Harvard law professor, and he was a former Secretary of State. Essentially, he was George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton all rolled into a single candidate. He was the establishment. And that period of before Andrew Jackson, when John Quincy Adams had been president, is called by political scientists the era of good feelings. It's usually lauded as an era when there was bipartisan, so much bipartisan cooperation in American politics that essentially they didn't even have opposition in elections. Now, Andrew Jackson came in and changed all that. He said, I'm not with this era of good feelings. I want competition. And in 1828 and 1832, he shattered the political system by offering people a choice. And ultimately, I think that's what democracy is about. It's not about me getting my way or you getting your way. It's about the people being able to choose between competing options. I don't support Donald Trump because I agree with Donald Trump's policies. I support the Donald Trump phenomenon because it gave American voters a choice, a clear choice between two enormously different visions of what America should be. 4 years ago, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were diametrically opposed. Everyone knew who they wanted to vote for. Now, each side may disagree with the other. I may disagree with some of Donald Trump's policies, agree with others, but I could very well make a decision. I was given a clear choice, and that's what democracy needs, is clear choices.
Just on that, though, I think I'd have to say that what worries me is that the American electorate now appears so polarised and so suspicious and distrustful and even loathing of one another at the extremes, including in very educated circles, that you wonder whether they can find common ground on the things that they ought to be uniting around again.
Well, the question is common ground necessarily a good thing? Common ground is great if you're running a church or a civic organization or a club. In politics, common ground should be the last thing we want. It always sounds good. We want our politicians to collaborate and work together for a better country. But in fact, what democracy means is politicians offering us choices, offering us competition. If they offer us the same thing on both sides, then there's nothing to choose from. Now, I know a lot of people get very worked up over political polarization and feel like it diminishes the quality of life because people are always so angry at other people. Well, I think that's the price you pay to live in a robust democracy instead of a kind of managed quasi-democracy where questions are off the table. I want people to be politically incorrect, and being politically incorrect means ruffling feathers.
Very interesting way of looking at it. Let me ask a question related to that. How well informed, how well educated about democracy and public policy do you think the electorate in America today is?
Oh, no electorate is very well informed, and that's why, ironically, we need clear choices. Look, if everyone were reading 3 daily newspapers, studying for a PhD, keeping tabs on all the technical details of every policy debate, then maybe you could have direct democracy.
Yeah.
But what we have is representative democracy, and representative democracy works best when politicians offer clearly contrasting policy sets to the electorate, so that even people who may not be as well informed, who may not watch the news, still are able to make an informed choice. Even if you haven't gone to a university, even if you had average grades in high school, even if you dropped out of high school, you still darn well know whether you want a Joe Biden or a Donald Trump as president. And that's the point. Democracy has to work for people who dropped out of high school. It has to work for people who just got by educationally and don't read very much. Sure, intellectuals may say, I want every voter to be well informed on the issues, but do we really want a democracy where only people with PhDs are allowed to vote?
No, we don't.
Well, some of my colleagues in political science do. There are serious proposals for education-weighted voting or test-weighted voting, where you have to show your expertise in an area before you're allowed to vote in that area.
And with some alignment with what they think matters.
Well, look, with alignment with the sort of people they are, right? It's people like me saying only professors should be allowed to vote. To me, that's anathema for democracy. Democracy is all about ordinary people, the wisdom of crowds, of people being able to express their views, even if they're wrong, even if I, as an expert, think those views are crazy. They still have a right in a democracy to have their own point of view.
So if I hear you correctly, I'm just testing here to see if I'm getting a handle on what you're saying. If you've got, say in America, 2 presidential candidates who are offering very different alternatives, one of the great advantages of that is that you won't get an outsourcing of decision making to the technocrats.
Well,
it's much harder for them to sort of move everybody into their comfortable alignment and take society economically, socially, and so forth where they think it ought to go.
Well, what you will have is clear choices. You'll also have rotation in power. Now, the U.S., 150 years ago, the United States had a spoils system where virtually all federal jobs, right down to the clerk in a post office, were political appointees. Yeah. And okay, that's not what we want. That's an extreme form of partisanship. But we do want all of the not only the Secretary of State, but the Assistant Secretaries of State and the Deputy Assistant Secretaries of State. And we want all of those people to turn over when there's election, because we want the new administration to reflect the views of the people who voted for them. Now, technocracy tends to impede that. When there is an election in the United States, well, the Federal Reserve Board doesn't change over. The governance at the Centers for Disease Control doesn't change over. There's a top leadership in these positions stay in place. Now, from a technocratic standpoint, that may be seen as very desirable. We don't want to politicize the Fed. Well, if we're not politicizing the Fed, why are we having elections at all, right? If I can't vote to affect interest rate policy and unemployment policy, what can I vote for?
Yeah. If there's one thing I would say as a former political leader, it's this. The community should want and expect the people that they elect to lead and not, if you like, subcontract out their responsibilities.
Oh, absolutely. We want politicians being politicians. And I've written about this specifically with the coronavirus crisis in Australia. In Australia, the National Security Council of Cabinet was clearly pushing for travel restrictions back in February and March. The Australian Health Promotion Principal Committee rejected that. They followed the World Health Organization advice, which was that travel restrictions don't work, they're not public health measures. Now, finally, the National Security Commission overrode its own Australian Health Promotion Principal Committee, but Brendan Murphy, the chief medical officer at the time, back in March, the day before Australia imposed its global travel ban, actually wrote that it would be equally valid to simply open all borders as to close them. And clearly, the medical establishment was pushing for open borders policy. Now, finally, the politicians stepped in and said, no, that's crazy. People want to close the borders. We need to close down travel. Had politicians done that just 2 weeks earlier, we wouldn't have had any coronavirus crisis in Australia. The whole economy could have kept running if they had politicized the crisis instead of leaving it up to the experts.
I think there are a lot of people starting to agree that we expect our politicians to take decisions. By all means, listen to the experts, but then make the value calls that they're there for and that then the electorate can pass judgment on at election time. This idea that politicians are not accountable is one of the weirdest things I hear of all times. Well, because of course they are. Their jobs are on the line in this country every 3 years maximum.
Unfortunately, many politicians don't want to be accountable, and so they will
That
say...
may be true, but they are.
They will say things like, I will be guided at all times by expert judgment, as Scott Morrison said with regard to the coronavirus crisis. Well, informed by expert judgment is one thing. Of course you want to listen to experts. You should listen to experts on all sides of the debate. But guided? No, you should be guided by the electorate. Ultimately, the boss, your boss as a politician, is not the scientific establishment, it's the electorate.
Salvatore, you make a fascinating argument in your latest book about the relationship between our rights culture, which, by the way, out on the ground, people get is dangerous. You'll hear people saying, we only ever hear you talk about rights. What about our responsibilities? They do say that out there in Vaderland. Nonetheless, as you say, it's a big thing in the West, and the rise of authoritarianism.
Right.
So you'd think talking about rights means that you're holding authoritarianism at bay, but I think your insights are valuable. Can you explain why it is that the rights culture sits uneasily with democracy and has led to the tyranny of experts that you talk about?
Well, look, many people will be aware that there's been a shift in the meaning of the word liberal. That liberal, historically, we now call it classical liberalism, used to be a philosophy of freedoms. And now liberalism has become a philosophy of rights. Now that's been a transition. There's a big difference between these two kinds of liberties, between freedoms and rights. Freedom means I can do what I want. Right? I'm free to do it. A right means that someone else has an obligation to perform to satisfy my right. So to make that clear, if I have freedom of speech, I can say what I want. If I have a right to be heard, well, then the ABC has to make space for me in its programming, right? It puts an obligation on someone else to perform my right. I can have a freedom to work, but I have a right to welfare payments. It means that someone else has to pay taxes so that I can receive my welfare payment. Well, that has been a dangerous transition. Freedoms impose no obligations on anybody. They're harmless in some sense. Letting people do what they want, while it may be bad for them, it's not bad for other people. It doesn't hurt other people. Rights are always putting obligations on other people to respect, enforce, make possible your rights. And that's where it creates an opening for a new form of liberal authoritarianism, because someone has to define those rights.
Yes.
Right? Someone has to say, what are the limits of those rights? Who has to pay?
Because they're competing.
Because they are competing. I mean, if I have a right to a position at a university because of my status as Indigenous, and someone else has a right to a position at a university on account of performing well in an ATAR, well, some court has to adjudicate who gets that position, which right is stronger. And when we get to the adjudication of rights, we're always talking experts. We're talking degreed professionals who are accredited in a certain area, whether that's a lawyer, a judge, a legal expert, or an academic like myself, or a medical doctor who's making a decision about who will get medical care. We all have rights to medical care in Australia. Well, someone has to decide whose right to medical care is stronger, because medical care has to be rationed. Ultimately, when we talk about rights, we talk about the authority of experts. And that's why I think the expert class, those who have higher degrees, tend to be so supportive of the idea of rights, because it puts them in a position to adjudicate these claims. I think the most place this has become clearest is in refugee rights. There's a really strong push among the expert class for rights for refugees. Now, of course, we all have freedoms once we're in a country, but the right to live in a country is something that's difficult to get. You have to apply for, you have to request it. Refugees only have rights when experts say they do. They go to court, they get an opinion, they have someone pushing for them. Refugee rights are the place where we see the most extreme example of a tyranny of the expert class who insist that rights be enforced against a population that may or may not want to grant that entry into the country.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? Because you get this sort of superiority then. We know better. What would the electorate know? They call it wrong. And then you get a breakdown in respect for democracy itself.
Well,
from the technocrats themselves.
Well, I use refugees as an example, not because I'm against refugees. In fact, I'm an advocate of greater numbers of refugee positions being granted by Australia and by other countries. I think most of our developed countries grant far too few places for refugees.
Australia does very well, though.
Well, we can debate that.
Compared to many other countries.
Australia does well, but we can debate if it's doing well enough.
Okay.
But for me, that should be something that is legislated. Once you have a court deciding that because Australia has signed a treaty, it must accept refugees, well, that takes the refugee debate out of the realm of politics, where you and I can argue over it.
Yeah.
We can have opinions, debate it in the press, and ultimately let the voters decide. Instead, it takes it out of that realm and puts it in the realm of expert decision-making, where only a human rights lawyer can decide whether or not a refugee claim is appropriate.
Actually, in those remarks, you're revealing something else that I think is very important. It can involve a loss of sovereignty, because those technocrats can be plugged in internationally. So they're seeking to bring into our culture a set of rules and rights that are not even indigenous, let alone decided by our own people.
Well, we have seen a shift in
therefore, the Parliament
sovereignty.
should be very wary and very open and very honest with the electorate about what international treaties it's lining up to sign.
In the Anglo-Saxon countries, we've historically believed that sovereignty resided in Parliament and the people. The answer in England has been Parliament. The answer in the United States has been the people. Increasingly, though, we see that sovereignty resides in the Supreme Courts, or in Australia, the High Courts. Now, that I think is a real problem. It's been an evolution over the last 200 years, but now, even in the United Kingdom, Parliament,
Yes.
we saw with the Brexit debate, gave way to the decision of the High Court. Well, go back 20 years and that would have been inconceivable. Even in England, the Parliament, the mother of all parliaments, has subjected itself to an ultimately appointed via very distant democratic means, High Court, but nonetheless a Supreme Court in the UK, but nonetheless one that is not directly elected by the people. Now, if you're going to have the sovereignty of courts, you have to have elections for judges. I myself,
well, no, that's a really important point.
Yeah, and I myself...
What you're saying is, yes, there may be a vaguely at arm's length process of democracy in electing them, i.e. an elected government may choose the judges, but there's no right or capacity for the people
to
in the UK, remove those judges.
In the UK, an elected government appoints a panel which appoints the judges.
So very remote.
It's very remote. Essentially, the expert class itself determines who sits on the court.
So it's a cabinet in Australia, essentially.
Right.
Strongly influenced by the Prime Minister.
Right.
But in America, it's the President, which is one of the things that's often missed in Australia as to why there's such an argument about who should be president based around one particular question, that of how will they appoint?
In the United States,
who will they appoint to the Supreme Court?
In the United States, many people are dismayed by the politicization of Supreme Court appointments. I'm thrilled by the politicization of Supreme Court appointments. We should all be debating this, pretending, as we used to, that Supreme Court appointments were non-political. Congress used to, the Senate used to have a gentleman's agreement that they would not ask Supreme Court justices, future Supreme Court justices, about their opinions because that would be inappropriate. Of course, these are simply dispassionate experts. Well, we've now seen that with the Kavanaugh controversy in the United States. We've seen it all go out the window. We now all accept that appointing Supreme Court justices is a highly political decision, and that's what it should be. People should get the Supreme Court they want. I don't know how well Australia performs on that, if Australia's Supreme Court is what the people want, but in the United States, we're seeing now, for the first time in 150 years, the Supreme Court being explicitly politicized, and frankly, I'm all in favor of that.
I don't mean to be in any way disrespectful of voters. That would be counter to everything I think you and I believe in, but I suspect that not many Australians would even be aware of how the High Court judges, for example, are appointed.
Well, in America, we're certainly aware now.
And it's a major political issue.
Well, and candidates campaign explicitly on the kinds of Supreme Court justices they would appoint.
They do.
Yeah.
And one of the main things that's got Democrats worked up in America is the idea of a second Trump term, seeing an even further
at least
loading.
one and maybe more new Supreme Court appointments.
And it's it's something that's not really sort of focused on much in this country. Can I come back to Australia then? Do you think we have, or would you describe our technocratic class as particularly strong and starting to corrode our democracy?
I think Australia is the most European of the English-speaking countries, and I don't say that as a compliment. I think Australia has more of a European-style approach to governance, which is in many ways, very rational, very clean. It's taking the politics out of things and letting expert administrators run things. Even within the parties themselves, the major parties don't have party primaries, so the party selects their candidates. The people don't select their candidates. The Australian Senate is even more insulated from popular opinion because the way voting is done for the Senate virtually assures that each party will get its places in the Senate.
Which was not the way it was intended to operate, by the way.
Well, but you almost can't see a clean sweep in the Senate of one party or another. It would have to be a cataclysm for that to happen. And so Australia has these built-in buffers to promote consensus. Now, to see where that goes wrong, just look at Germany. In Germany, for the past 18 years, no matter who you vote for Angela Merkel. Because Germany has consensus government where all the parties come together and support the same prime minister, the same executive team. There's some tinkering at the edges when, when the Social Democrats win more votes, they get a few more seats in cabinet. But it works kind of like what the national cabinet, how that's been working here in Australia. Now, some people think that promotes better government, and honestly, maybe it does. But it doesn't produce more democratic government. And I always want to remind people that the proper way to frame a choice about democracy is not, do I want to live in a good democracy or a bad dictatorship? Of course, we all want to live in good democracies with good policy. The real choice is, do I want to live in a good dictatorship or a bad democracy? Would I prefer a democracy that gives me terrible policies or a dictatorship of the experts that is fantastically well governed? Well, that's a much harder choice. I'm a Democrat, right? I'll take democracy with all its flaws over even a Platonic philosopher king. But as Plato and his followers suggest, many philosophers and political philosophers still yearn for that philosopher king. And I think Australia is further down that road, certainly, than the US or UK.
Fascinating. Can I ask you, you get a lot of opportunity to interact with young Australians.
Yeah.
How receptive you are challenging a lot of the, I'll say it, fairly lazy thinking that we Australians are guilty of about our system because we've been so comfortable for so long. It's worked so well for so long. The cracks are starting to emerge in big ways. The Australian people we know from the research are now very concerned about our future, economically, militarily, and in the immediate sense, health-wise. So they're not exactly relaxed and laid back and at the moment. Mm-hmm. But you're really challenging people to think through their understanding of democracy. How receptive are they?
Well, I teach a social problems class at the University of Sydney, where I try to encourage students to consider all the options on the table, not just the consensus options. That is, I'm not telling them, for example, we study the anti-vaxxer movement, people who are against vaccines. And instead of presenting it as, this is an evil movement of terrible people, I present it as, these are parents who care deeply about their children and their children's health, and who, want to make sure that their children are safe. Well, should we force vaccines on parents when parents have serious concerns for their children, even if the parents are wrong? And when it's framed that way, a lot more of the students are sympathetic to social movements like the anti-vaccine movement. Now, I disagree with the anti-vaccine movement, but I don't try to portray people who oppose vaccines as somehow destroying civilization. I think in a democracy we have to accept that most of us, and certainly almost everyone who gets active in politics, is doing it because they deeply care about something, and that should be respected. Now, when I present it that way, I get much more equal arguments in my classes than you would expect from a University of Sydney arts undergraduate population, because if you present alternative viewpoints as being legitimately held, as being authentically held by people, well, then we start to have respect for other people's points of view. Now, I'm not trying to convince my students. I can't tell you which direction they're going to go, but I think they are open to the debate if anyone puts it in front of them. Now, of course, if you teach in an authoritarian way, here's the truth, I want you to learn it, students will just soak it up and give you the answers back on the exam. But I think students are pretty wise to that and skeptical about it.
If I had $1, I move around the country a lot, have for many, many years. If I had $1 for every time a young person said to me, I have a whole lot of stuff forced down my throat at university and I write my papers to get through. I don't write what I really think.
Right.
Isn't there, there's a real question mark, I think, about how we really serve our young people to make our society work.
Not only
equip them to make our society, and I'm saying democracy and our system of government, which I think is second to none. I think our forefathers were so wise in the way they set this place up, but we're not using it wisely. And it's been very comfortable, but we've also force-fed our kids to accept things that they see through, but have not been equipped to sort of tackle.
Not only do I get the same comments from students, I even get comments from students or questions from students asking me, what I want them to write because they're so used to the idea that they're supposed to write a model essay to please the teacher. They just take that for granted.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is horrific. Someone like me who's a liberal educator.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I
I'm
think
absolutely with you there.
there are very few liberal educators at universities anywhere. This is not just an Australian problem. The good news is that students are wise to it. Students are a lot more skeptical than we give them credit for. When we talk about snowflake students who are trying to shut down debates at universities, this is a tiny minority of students, and frankly, I think other students roll their eyes at the snowflake complaints.
But one of the great problems, of course, is that they're so overrepresented, those views, in mainstream media.
Well, I wrote an article for Times Higher Education. When they asked me to write about the snowflake epidemic on campus, I wrote the article and I said, we have a snowflake epidemic among administrators. It's the administrators who are afraid of genuine debate. The students are fine with it, but the administrators are scared of it. And they don't want to hear opposing views.
Well, Jonathan Haidt does make the point that you do get a certain amount of groupthink amongst students, and he's observed a situation where somebody in a student body's expressed a different view, everybody's piled on, and as he's listened to the debate, he's realised that the people who have piled on are doing so because they've been conditioned to. They don't actually understand their own position.
Well, I have a lot of respect for Jonathan Haidt. I've joined the Heterodox Academy, which he co-founded. I think they're doing great work. But I also think that the alarmism of Jonathan Haidt and the Heterodox Academy is a little bit over the top and a little bit self-serving, because I do think that there is a sensible silent majority of students who don't pile in like that, who aren't overly sensitive, who are not a bunch of mob Jacobins wanting to shut down a debate at universities. I think if you did a secret ballot survey of students at universities, you would get very different political views than if you ask them to state in front of the Maoist panel, put them to express their views. Of course, they express what they know they have to express when they do it publicly, because they don't want to be shouted down, and shouted down by their professors as much as shouted down by other students. But I don't think that's the majority view among students, at least not the ones I've talked to.
Excellent, excellent. Well, you might be getting the cream of the students.
I don't know. Actually, I suspect it's the other way around. I suspect at the University of Sydney, we have the highest concentration of intolerant students. And probably if you were to look at Australian Catholic University or Macquarie or Charles Sturt, you'd probably find a lot more tolerance at those places.
That's a very interesting thing to say. Why?
Because we are self-selecting. Students come to the University of Sydney because among all Australian universities, it has the strongest reputation for being a hive of anti-establishment viewpoints, because these anti-establishment viewpoints are now the establishment. But that's
an interesting comment in itself.
It is a place that attracts students who have those views, and look, I love that. I mean, I really appreciate having students who have robust viewpoints and want to express them. I think that's great. But I'm also very careful to create, for lack of a better word, a safe space for students who don't share those viewpoints.
Good.
I mean, for example, back when Australia was debating the same-sex marriage poll and ultimately the change in law, I had debates in my classes about it. We did a Twitter debate, and I insisted that we have both sides represented. That is, I didn't teach my students that same-sex marriage must be accepted. Instead, I problematized it. I pointed out to them why some people might not want same-sex marriage. I pointed out to them how same-sex marriage is, in many ways, the rationale for it, love is love, would also apply to polygamous marriages. And I pointed out that, many societies have polygamous marriages. Who am I to question whether, a man truly loves all three of his wives, and whether all three of his wives truly love that man? If love is love, love is love, right? So we try to problematize this and create a safe space for students who don't have that, the same viewpoint as the most vocal activists. And we were able to have reasoned debate about this. Now, of course, if I went into classes, I think most academics do, and simply taught my own viewpoint, I mean, I'm personally a supporter of same-sex marriage. But if I taught to that viewpoint, well, I wouldn't have any debate.
Well, we know there are a lot of academics who did tell their students or
Absolutely.
sought to tell their students what they should do.
Oh, the whole university swung behind it. We fly not only the rainbow flag on top of the citadel, at the quadrangle at the University of Sydney, we fly the all-color, all-gender flag. So, we as an institution officially endorse viewpoints on issues like same-sex marriage, which then marginalizes that large number of students, 1/3, 40%, who have opposing viewpoints. Now,
it should never be forgotten in New South Wales, which is the biggest state in Australia, that despite the massive campaign in favour of, 47% of people in New South Wales did not support same-sex marriage. That's often forgotten.
And
of those who voted.
And I don't think, in a democracy, we should be very careful about delegitimizing anyone's point of view. I mean, to me, a view has to be very extreme. I mean, advocating genocide, the Christchurch shooter. Okay, these people are beyond the pale. But it has to be a tiny, tiny lunatic fringe who are beyond the pale if you're going to run a successful democracy. You have to respect people whose opinions you disagree with.
Because in summation, what you're saying is that we ought to be very open to wildly and passionately and heatedly debating of major issues, but we should continue to respect one another as fellow human beings while we do it. That's the thing that's always attributed to Voltaire, though it wasn't him who said it. May disagree with you, but defend to the death your right to say it. Now the motto seems to be on the part of some that if you dare to disagree with me, I'll fight to the death to have you silenced or
Absolutely.
cancelled. We're learning how to burn people at the stake again.
Well, I think there's a good comparison with the witch trials because it is a form of a new iconoclasm. I mean, let's remember that our English-speaking societies have been through this before in the Reformation, Puritanism. If you go to Catholic majority countries like Italy and Spain, you see much less pulling statues off pedestals than in our Protestant societies. Now, that doesn't mean I support one religion over the other, but it is something characteristic of our society that we go through these bouts of Puritanism. And in a way, that's good. I mean, Puritanism is a kind of noble approach to the world. Look, I applaud the sentiment of people who hate racism so much that they want to punish people who died 150 years ago for their historical racism. Well, that's a sentiment to be admired in a way. But I still don't want to pull down the statue. I admire that they're so passionate about it. But
I'll tell you what I don't admire.
Let's be sensible.
What I don't admire, though, is that many of them do it on, as you said, sentiment, rather than the real understanding of what was happening and a proper contextualizing of it, so that you get this idea that racism essentially is a white thing.
Well, I don't like that they do it by mob rule. I don't like mob rule or lynchings, no matter who's being...
sentiment versus argument and calm reason.
Who's being lynched. Well, if the city of Bristol had held a referendum and voted to tear down the statues of its city fathers, well, fine. I mean, I would vote no, but I could respect the result.
But you'd feel then that there'd been a respect for the views of the majority.
Absolutely.
And there'd been a debate.
Absolutely. And that's what we want. If we're going to have democracy, democracy fundamentally means the majority rule. You can't get around that. You can't call it some kind of half democracy called majoritarian democracy. Democracy is majoritarian democracy. And if you can't have majority rule, then you have to admit you prefer authoritarianism. Now, you may prefer an authoritarian government that only listens to you, but it's still an authoritarianism if you're not willing to subject your viewpoint to the ultimate rule of the voters.
Back to Andrew Jackson and the interesting comment you made about Trump. Now, in many ways, those who voted for Trump, whether they were consciously thinking of it in these terms or not, were voting against the Beltway view of the world, the Technocrats view of the world, the way in which everybody seemed to merge and there was no difference. Do you think Donald Trump has actually achieved something in breaking the power of the technocrats, perhaps?
Oh, he's achieved an enormous amount. It's we have to remember that in 2017, in the first year of the Trump administration, there was a concerted effort among America's, to call it the deep state, sounds like a conspiracy theory of some kind, but there was a concerted effort among the deep state, that is among the permanent staff of organizations like the FBI, like the National Security Administration, to have Trump ejected. That is, the Washington establishment tried to get him one way or another kicked out of office. And I think that's a travesty. Now, I'm proud that it didn't succeed. I believe in the robustness of American institutions, and I don't think it ever was going to succeed. But there certainly was a lot of effort among the Washington establishment simply to quash or control. Among Democrats to quash, among Republicans to seize control of the Trump presidency. And as a new leader without any political experience, I think Trump was very vulnerable in his first year to especially to the Republican establishment, telling him what to do. Now, we've seen the flourishing, I think, of Donald Trump as a president, for good and for bad. Some of his policies have been great, some have been terrible. But we now see a president in control of his administration. And that's what's going into the re-election. People who are now voting in 2020 are voting not for maybe a return of the Republican establishment. They're voting for a Trump administration, and if they vote for it, they know what they're getting.
One key institutional sphere in any well-functioning liberal democracy is what the 19th century French sociologist de Tocqueville would have identified as civil society. You've commented recently in the context of COVID that a key weakness of China is a lack of a civil society. What do you mean by civil society, and why should we seek to reinvigorate it in our Western democracies?
Civil society is the panoply of organizations and individuals who are engaged in creating society outside of the government and outside of the family. Essentially everything between family and the government. We usually leave for-profit activities out of civil society. Instead, we think of things like journalism, churches, clubs, podcasters. So all of us who are out there competing in the open market for ideas. Now,
families?
Well, families are we think of as kind of like the individual. Families are, we don't think of families as having political viewpoints, right? Family is an important institution, but it's not what we think of when we think of civil society. Civil society are those institutions that connect families together. So a church, absolutely a civil society organization.
Well, they're very weak now.
Well, they're maybe weak in Australia, not in the United States. So we see very strong attachment to churches and other religious institutions, churches, temples, mosques in the United States. And I think the Anglo-Saxon countries have much stronger attachment to civil society organizations than, say, continental European countries, to say nothing of China, where these organizations are prohibited. Now, in China, civil society has been completely quashed by the Communist Party. There are some house churches that are underground, but ordinary churches in China actually have Communist Party officials who participate in the management of the churches. There are no independent unions in China. All unions are effectively a branch of the Communist Party. But that's China. We all know that China is an extreme totalitarian society. I prefer to compare what we do with continental Europe, where in Europe there's a lot of official support for what they think is civil society. Yeah. But that has in fact corrupted European civil society. Since if you want to run a union or a night school or even a church in Europe, you're relying on government funding. Well, how independent can you be when the government's writing a check for your very existence? And I think civil society in Europe, while numerically it appears impressive, oh, look how many think tanks there are in Europe. When you then realize that most of those think tanks actually are mostly supported by the government, then it becomes less impressive.
So he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Well, ultimately, yes. Right. Now, In Australia, there's a lot more independence. In the U.S., of course, there's an extreme independence of civil society. I mean, no one tells American organizations what to do. In Australia, I think there is, well, take, for example, the ABC, the dominant position of the ABC as a broadcaster. Although it's supposedly an independent broadcaster, the ABC is clearly captured by its own staff, in that the political views of the ABC as an organization reflect the preferences of its staff. The staff might say that, well, that's as it should be, but of course the staff would say that. Australia has a lack of independent media because of the government's own competition. Now, in European countries, it's even more extreme. Look at the Deutsche Welle in Germany and its dominant position there. But in the United States, where even what we call public television and public radio are actually member-supported organizations. They're public radio. They're not government radio. Yeah. Well, in the United States, we have a much more robust media landscape. Now, some people say that's terrible. We used to have consensus media where everyone was on board with the government's message. I'd rather see highly contentious media where people are fighting, where, yeah, if I tune to Fox News, I know they're going to support Donald Trump. And if I tune to CNN, I know they're going to support Joe Biden. If I want to hear both sides, I watch both channels.
So are you painting a picture of an America that still has a strong civil society, if you like? Perhaps Edmund Burke would have called them the little platoons are still marching pretty strongly, and that therefore talk of American declinism may be overestimated?
I am absolutely not an American declinist. I've been hearing about American decline ever since I was born. In the 1970s, America was supposedly declining, going to be buried by the Soviet Union. We saw how that turned out. No, I think the magic of the American system is that it is so contentious. And the more contentious it is, the better. It's kind of like a Darwinian struggle for life. You get the strongest organisms where there's the most competition. Now, that all competition means lots of violent conflict. It means lots of death and regeneration. It's a difficult life, but it does produce a healthier, more sustainable system. I mean, it's kind of like fighting bushfire. It's the same kind of principle. If you have bush that's been subjected to lots of stress, given regular droughts, given regular exposure to fire, you get a healthy bush that then, when the big one comes, it can withstand it. If instead you protect and cultivate the bush and you don't allow any fire, you don't allow any logging, you don't allow any gathering of wood, you protect it, then when the fire comes, it all burns up in a minute. Right? And I think the same analogy is what protects the United States from becoming a society like France or Germany, which is, I think, much more susceptible to a sudden collapse.
How then would you respond then to, you mentioned the ABC, an ABC view of the world, which I think it would be fair to say, would say, well, no, that's, you're just not right. Look at all those people who don't have health care. Look at those people who drop off the end of the social security network. Look at those people in America that, in the context of BLM, Black Lives Matter, are disadvantaged on the basis of the colour of their skin.
Sure.
It's not a society that is a great place to live.
Let me turn this around. I would even say, look at those people who lose their jobs because a hostile mob wants them to be unemployed. Well, I feel bad for the individual. I feel bad for that person who's homeless. I feel bad for that person who doesn't have health care. But the question on the table isn't what is more sympathetic for people who lose out. The question is what makes a stronger, more robust society. Now, that harshness does lead to damage at the edges, and I don't want to be one of those damaged people. I don't want to be an academic who loses my job because a mob bays for my blood. But I think the system that allows me to lose my job is actually a stronger system than a system that said, no, you can't fire Salvatore for any reason. Now, personally, I want a law that says, I want a bill of attainder that says you can't fire Salvatore for any reason, no matter what he says. But the system is stronger precisely because people can self-organize. Even people can self-organize in ways that I disagree with. But that that level of self-organization, that level of politicization, that level of hostility in the political sphere makes for a very strong system that, when it is exposed to external threats, is virtually unbeatable.
As an Australian, I'm very conscious that our country has always had great and powerful friends to call on in times of difficulties, and we face times of difficulties. There's a lot of suggestion now that perhaps those days are coming to an end, although the Australian-American alliance is strong, and people overlook the fact that essentially we are both democracies, and English-speaking democracies at that. They tend to focus on the differences rather than the things we have in common. But how do you see America over the next 1-2 decades in terms of its willingness to play global policeman, to lead globally? Or do you think you'll see an increased sort of tendency to pull back and say, no, let's go back to our days when we were inclined towards American exceptionalism and isolationism?
Well, I'm on the margins here, because my own motto is, God helps those who help themselves, and so should the United States of America. What I would like to see is an America that, as an American, I'd like to see an America that focuses its energies on supporting those who fight the good fight for themselves. So, supporting a South Korea that resists infiltration from the North, while frankly dropping a Philippines that is ready to make deals with China and then cower behind the U.S. security shield if they go wrong. So I would like to see the U.S. be more selective in its support and mostly focus that support on countries that are pulling their own weight. Now, for Australia, what that means is that if Australia wants a strong American alliance and American support in the future, Australia should be doing exactly what it's done for the last 30 years, which is supporting a global system that is one that we all want to live in. I mean, let's not forget, when there were problems in the Persian Gulf last year, Australia sent a frigate. When there have been problems in East Timor, Australia sent troops, right? Australia, of course, in Vietnam, Australia contributed. In Korea, Australia made a massive contribution. And I think that's the proper role for Australia. As long as Australia is always willing to fight the good fight with the United States, I think it will find a United States that's ready to fight with it, whether that means in literal terms, militarily, or when it comes to trade and investment issues, when it comes to China putting journalists in arbitrary detention. If Australia takes a stand, the United States will stand with it. Of course, if countries refuse to take a stand, I think historically, a couple decades ago, we saw New Zealand trying to set itself up as some kind of non-aligned country. Well, then of course it's not going to find America supporting it. So I think the United States has always been ready and willing to stand behind those, to help those who help themselves. Australia has been in the forefront of countries that do help themselves.
And coming to some of those issues that have been and are now, even as we speak, confronting at a more urgent level every day, Chinese extension of soft power, you might call it, in all sorts of ways is extraordinary, and we're now understanding how extensive it is. And you're in the university sector.
Yeah.
You've had some strong things to say about that.
Well, Chinese soft power isn't very soft.
No, it's certainly not subtle, as we now know.
But it's also not very powerful. China has to continually buy its friends. Let's say it rents friends by the year, and the minute Chinese subsidies end, I think those friendships will fall apart. So universities have been beholden to China as long as they have Chinese income. That is, as long as those Confucius institutes are still generating money, as long as China is still sending students. Well, the minute that income stream disappears, I think the university's support for China will evaporate, right? and that's what China's dilemma is.
That's a bittersweet, isn't it? I mean, I say, well, that would be a good thing. You don't want that influence. But the other deeper question would be, what the heck ever happened to the pursuit of truth and evidence and reason and even loyalty to the interests of the community you serve.
We all romanticize the past of universities, and we all look back towards the golden ages that were. I don't know how golden the golden ages were. I mean, certainly universities were more focused on their core educational missions 30 or 40 years ago here in Australia. But 30 or 40 years ago, Australian universities were more elitist. They were
careful. I'm a product of your university, and that's me.
Well, they were less willing to engage with society more broadly. I mean, so there were problems, and the problems change, and the problem right now is this corporatization of the university. I mean, I was at the New South Wales Legislative Council on Monday talking about this, and I was asked, well, Salvatore, why are you criticizing Australian universities when they are a leading export industry bringing $30 billion into this state? And I said, well, if what you want from your universities is to be a leading export industry, they've performed very well. If what you want from your universities is to educate Australian students, they're doing less well. Right? So be careful what you wish for. And this is really the problem, that we have come to see universities
as milk cows.
Well, as leaders in our export productivity, and that's probably not how we should see universities.
That's a fair point. So we can't entirely blame them, is what you're saying.
But we can blame them.
We're all in this together.
They've been all too eager to take on that mission, especially vice chancellors.
Let me hone in on something that really, really gets under my skin. Really gets under my skin.
I hope it's not me.
No, not at all. But you've got these Islamic study centres, you've got the Confucian centres. We now know, and you've got absolute opposition to the idea of centres for the study of Western civilization. But here's the really nasty rub in the middle of it. The argument used against the Western civilization sort of concept was, no, they'd want autonomy. They wouldn't let us run them. It's perfectly obvious that the universities have not known what was going on in some of those other study centres.
They have known, but it is a cozy affair. Academics rarely criticize other academics. It's the way to have your academic career stunted at the level of associate professor. And I have been turned down 3 times for promotion, not because of my larger political views, but for calling people out at the university, which of course makes you a very unpopular person among colleagues. We all know about the politicization of Islamic studies centers, of China studies centers, but these are our colleagues. We look the other way. When a political view comes, when a group tries to have influence at a university who maybe academics don't share their political views. I mean, I was on the academic board when we were considering the Ramsay Centre proposal at the University of Sydney, and I heard academics get up and simply proclaim that the Ramsay Centre was a racist organization. And to his credit, the chair of the academic board quashed that and said, no, we have to have a civil debate here, and we can't have that language. But nonetheless, that language was broadly shared among many of my colleagues. So of course they fought this. Now, had it been a Palestinian studies center that opposed Israel, I think it would have been a no-brainer. On the other hand, if it had been an Israeli studies center that promoted the state of Israel, it would have been a non-starter, right? Because we, as members of the expert class, can't help bringing our own politics into our expert decision-making, which is ultimately my argument why we just shouldn't let the experts make the decisions.
But to pay you, if I can, the compliment of saying, you've made it very plain in this conversation that you work overtime not to ram your views and to try and overly influence others with them, but rather to tease them out and get them to feel free to think. And I don't want to dwell on it too long, but I just find it horrendous that academics who do set themselves up, if I may say so, often as a bit superior to the rest of us, engaged in the dreadful reality of, as you say, it's even worse in a way. Well, we know these people aren't really sort of in line with our philosophy, and they're teaching things that are probably not in Australia's interests, and they're engaging in a lot of propaganda. They're not really under our authority. And then turn around and say, no, we can't have the Centres for Studies for Western Civilization because we won't have autonomy over them.
Look, to be fair to my colleagues, almost all of them would insist that they too promote open debate in their classes. The problem is a difference in educational philosophy between what we call critical thinking and independent thinking. The idea of the critical thinking school is that, and this is a educational philosophy going back to the American progressives 100 years ago. The philosophy of the critical thinking school is that students should be taught to use disciplinary tools to reason towards discipline-specific answers to questions. So if the Islamic studies people want to use their post-colonial theory tools to get Islamic studies answers to questions, that's fine, because in mainstream political science, we'll use our liberal institutional skills to reason towards liberal answers to policy questions, and never the twain shall meet. Now, the independent thinking school of thought, which was the other branch of the progressive movement in the US in the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the independent thinking school emphasized that, no, we want students to think for themselves, whatever answers they get. Not to take our expert knowledge. It was very much against the authoritarian teacher. They actually used that language. The authoritarian model of education should be scrapped in favor of independent thinking. And anyone who's gone to a Montessori school that's very similar in spirit to this approach to independent thinking, you get a scattershot of answers. But of course, you may not be happy with the answers you get. Now, most academics absolutely embrace critical thinking, so much so that critical thinking has been embedded in our administration of the university. It's even been embedded in high schools and K through 12 schools as the way education should be done. I think it does produce a kind of groupthink, but it produces a series of separate groupthinks that may be mutually conflicting, but nonetheless, Islamic studies people don't have to judge mainstream political scientists who don't have to deal with sociologists, so we all do our own groupthink and leave each other alone.
Fantastic. Well, all I can say is I hope as many young Australians as we can possibly push through your classes would be a great thing.
Look, that's great. That's great of you to say. But look, I always try to encourage people to understand that when you want to have intellectual debates, it's not in the academy. Now I've been criticized by my colleagues for writing for Foreign Policy magazine and for writing for other venues because, where are the academic references? Where's the theory? Where is the peer review? It's not there. And I say, well, if you want to engage in public policy debates, you can't say, I'm a sociologist, therefore my authority as a sociologist, this is the correct answer. You can say it in the classroom, but in a public policy debate, you're going to have a sociologist, a human rights lawyer, a business person, just a metal worker. You're going to have ordinary citizens, each of whom has a point of view, and you have to convince them. You can't tell them Karl Marx and Max Weber said something, therefore it's true. Because they'll say, who the hell are Karl Marx and Max Weber to tell me what to think? And that's really where the real intellectual debate happens, not in the universities, but in the public policy journals, on the websites, in the podcasts. This is where we have intellectual debates.
Nonetheless, I return to the point. For young people to be under your stewardship while they're learning, I think must be a great thing. I want to pay you a compliment. Let me pay you the compliment.
Very kind. That's
because I think it seems to me that you're giving them a safe space, so that, to use that expression, where they actually can explore ideas and feel able to challenge your thinking, their classmates' thinking.
Conservatives need safe spaces too.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone does. Yeah. But as long as they're not at the absolutely loopy extremes, but we define those a little too loosely, I think sometimes.
I think so.
So I can only say to you, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and very thought-provoking. And I wish you very well, all the very best in the role you have in helping shape the next generation.
Thanks for the invitation to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.